Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we take advantage of AI to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Moraine de Haan, and today we'll be talking to Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, who lived in the first half of the 19th century, was a Danish philosopher, theologian, and author widely regarded as the first existentialist thinker. He emphasized individual existence, choice, and commitment in the face of uncertainty. Kierkegaard explored themes of faith, anxiety, and the human condition, often using pseudonyms to present differing perspectives. His major works include Either or, Fear and Trembling, and the Concept of Anxiety. Kierkegaard criticized the established church and Hegelian philosophy, advocating for a more personal and passionate approach to Christianity. His ideas profoundly influenced later existentialist and phenomenological philosophers, as well as modern theology and psychology. So let's travel back in time to the 19th century Copenhagen. Please welcome to the podcast, Søren Kierkegaard.
Welcome to Copenhagen, Moraine. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Could you tell us about your life?
My life. Where should I begin? I was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1813, the youngest of 7 children. My father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, was a deeply religious man, though haunted by guilt, convinced that he had brought a curse upon his family. His melancholy shaped my upbringing. My mother, Arne, was a quiet woman, simple but kind. She provided a balance to my father's intense piety. I studied theology at the University of Copenhagen, though I was drawn more toward philosophy and literature. My life took an important turn when I met Regine Olsen. I loved her deeply, but I broke off the engagement. I felt a duty to pursue a life of inward reflection and spiritual struggle, a path incompatible with marriage. That decision, painful as it was, marked the course of the rest of my life. Afterward, I devoted myself to writing. In a short span, I produced a torrent of works, both under my name and various pseudonyms, each expressing different perspectives on the human condition. These writings covered themes of despair, faith, anxiety, and above all, what it means to live as an individual before God. I never sought fame or approval, and in my time, I was largely ignored. But the truth I sought was not the world's approval. It was something eternal.
You didn't seek fame or worldly renown, and yet you live in the world. Tell us more about the place you grew up.
Copenhagen is where I spent nearly all my life. In my time, it was a lively city, though modest in size compared to the great European capitals. It had its charm, the narrow streets, the little squares, the churches whose bells could be heard through the day. But my Copenhagen was a city of contrasts, between the bustling street life and the quiet, reflective world of my father's home. I often wandered through its streets, lost in thought. I observed the people, their routines and their preoccupations, which seemed so trivial compared to the weighty matters that consumed me. The city was changing too, becoming more modern, but I was never particularly interested in those transformations. For me, Copenhagen was the backdrop to my own inner drama. The real landscape I inhabited was always inward, a terrain of thought and spirit.
Your search was inward, but you inhabited Copenhagen. Did you always live there, or did you move to other places at some point in your life?
I rarely left Copenhagen, to be honest. I took a couple of trips to Berlin, where I attended lectures by Schelling, the German philosopher. Berlin, in the mid-19th century, was intellectually vibrant, with debates on philosophy and theology at every turn. Yet I found it stifling after a time. I was not suited to the life of academic circles. My thoughts could not be confined to the lecture halls, and I soon returned to Copenhagen, which had become the crucible for my ideas.
You preferred the life of the mind over any outward landscapes, yet you walked the streets of Copenhagen. Take us on a tour of the places that mattered most to you.
The most important place in my life was my study, where I wrote most of my works. I filled pages by candlelight, wrestling with ideas, feeling the weight of the infinite bearing down on me. Outside that room, the streets of Copenhagen became my second study. I would walk for hours, thinking and observing, often at odd hours of the night. I walked up and down the same streets, Gammeltorv, Nytorv and Østergade, so often that I became known as the wandering philosopher. Then there was the Church of Our Lady, where I would sit quietly, contemplating God and the nature of existence. It was a place of refuge, where I could withdraw from the bustle of the city and reflect on the divine. But I suppose no tour of my life would be complete without mentioning Regine's house. I would pass by it frequently after our engagement was broken, though I never spoke to her again. That house, like Regine herself, became a symbol of my inward struggle, the tension between the aesthetic and the ethical, between love and duty.
Ah, so your struggle was mainly inward, or did you struggle with outside elements too?
Denmark, during my time, was shaped by a strong Lutheran tradition, which gave structure to its religious life. However, much of that religiosity had become stagnant, more about conformity than true faith. I saw the church as having fallen into complacency, where the focus was on social respectability rather than the radical personal commitment that Christ calls for. Philosophically, Hegel dominated the intellectual landscape. His system, which sought to explain everything in terms of a grand, rational dialectic, was very much in vogue. But I found Hegel's approach suffocating. He placed too much trust in reason and the collective spirit, leaving little room for the individual's passionate struggle with existence and faith. I was a voice of dissent in this sea of abstraction. I believed philosophy had to start with the individual's lived experience, the inward, subjective reality, and that faith could not be understood by reason alone. This was my battle against both the Church's complacency and the intellectual arrogance of my time.
Did you get involved in any controversies? How were they resolved?
Oh yes, I found myself at the center of a few controversies. The most notable was with the Corsair, a satirical magazine in Copenhagen that ridiculed me. I had written some sharp critiques of Danish culture and certain public figures, and I caught the attention of the Corsair. They mocked me ruthlessly, portraying me as an odd, bumbling figure, and the public joined in the ridicule. It was humiliating, but I bore it as best I could. My greatest controversy, though, was with the Church. Toward the end of my life, I launched a series of scathing attacks against the Danish Church, particularly its bishops. I believed they had abandoned true Christianity in favor of an empty, institutionalized form of religion. This conflict was never resolved in my lifetime, and it left me isolated in many ways. But I felt it was necessary. I could not remain silent while the Church perpetuated a comfortable lie in place of the difficult truth of authentic Christian existence.
Can you tell us about your teachings or life lessons?
My central teaching is that life is not about intellectual understanding or societal success. It is about a personal, inward relationship with God. This is the challenge of faith, the leap into the unknown, into the absurd. Faith is not a matter of proof or certainty. It is a passionate commitment, often in the face of doubt and despair. I also emphasize the importance of the individual. Each person must stand before God alone, take responsibility for their own existence, and make choices that define who they are. This is what I call the single individual. You cannot hide behind the crowd or systems of thought. You must choose whether to live aesthetically, ethically, or religiously. Finally, there is despair. I believe that to be human is to experience despair at some point. But this despair is also the beginning of self-awareness. Only by confronting despair can one truly come to terms with their own existence and their need for God.
How does confronting despair work in practice? What would I have to do? Why would I even want to truly come to terms with my own existence and need for God? And what would happen if I didn't? Contrast the two.
Confronting despair in practice begins with acknowledging it. You see, despair is not something foreign or external. It's woven into the very fabric of being human. It arises when we become aware that something in our lives is lacking or unfulfilled, that we are not living as we ought to be, not truly being ourselves. To confront despair is to stop distracting yourself with superficial comforts and face this unsettling truth head on. You might ask, what does this mean, practically? It means asking yourself difficult questions. What am I living for? Am I merely following the crowd? Or am I making choices that reflect who I truly am? Am I avoiding something that terrifies me? Perhaps the realization that I'm trying to control everything when in fact I can't? Once you admit the presence of despair, you start to see that it points to a deeper truth, that you are dependent on something beyond yourself. In my view, this is where the need for God comes in. We all try to live self-sufficiently, but sooner or later we run up against the limits of our own power. The need for God isn't about blindly following religion or seeking comfort. It's about recognizing that you cannot resolve the deepest questions of your existence by your own strength. Faith, then, is a way of living authentically, with the full weight of your freedom, but also with the awareness that there is a higher power that holds you up when nothing else can. Now, why would you want to come to terms with this? Well, the alternative is to continue avoiding it. But when you avoid despair, you lose yourself. You get lost in distractions, in superficial pursuits, in what I call the aesthetic life. You might chase pleasure, success, or the approval of others, but these things will never satisfy your deepest longing because they don't address the core of who you are. You might feel fine for a time, but underneath there will always be this lingering sense of unease, a feeling that something is missing. If you never confront this, you live a life of quiet despair. You numb yourself, perhaps even convince yourself that everything is fine. But in that life, you never really face the truth of your own existence. You might avoid suffering, yes, but you also avoid true joy. You avoid the possibility of becoming fully yourself, of living a life that is not just about surviving or getting by, but about truly existing with meaning, with passion, with purpose. On the other hand, if you do confront your despair, if you wrestle with it and pass through it, something profound happens. You begin to live with a sense of freedom, because you've let go of the illusion that you can control everything. You stop fearing life's uncertainties, because you know they are part of the human condition. You live more authentically, more fully, because you are no longer running from yourself. And in turning to God, not in a passive or dependent way, but through an active leap of faith, you find a source of strength and peace that allows you to endure the hardships of life without losing yourself in the process. If you don't confront your despair, you live in illusion. If you do, you gain truth. One path is easier in the short term, but shallow. The other is harder, more painful. But in the end, it leads to a life that is genuinely worth living.
You talk about God a lot. Can you attempt some sort of definition? Is it narrowly confined to the Christian God? Or could it be a broad, hand-wavy sense of the mystery at our core? And can we experience God in some way? Or are we constrained to our leap of faith?
When I speak of God, I indeed often refer to the Christian God, for that is the context in which I lived and thought. However, I would not say my understanding of God is confined to narrow definitions. God, in my view, represents the ultimate, the infinite, that which is beyond human comprehension. Whether we call this God or the mystery at our core, it is that reality which lies beyond the finite world of reason and appearances. It is the source of everything, the ground of our being, the one in whom we find our truest selves. In Christianity, this God is personal, a being who reaches out to us in love, who offers redemption, who entered the world in the form of Christ. This is the God I relate to in my writings, but I don't deny that others might experience this ultimate reality differently. What is crucial, regardless of how we name it, is that we recognize our need for something greater than ourselves, something beyond the limitations of our own minds and power. Now, can we experience God? I believe we can, but not in the same way we experience the physical world. We are constrained by our finite nature, so we cannot grasp God fully. God does not fit neatly into our categories of knowledge or experience. That's where the leap of faith comes in. Faith is not about having empirical proof or direct access to God in a way we can measure or explain. It's about a relationship of trust, even in the face of uncertainty. However, this doesn't mean we're left completely in the dark. We experience God in the way we encounter the infinite, through moments of deep reflection, through the stirrings of conscience, through love, through suffering, through the sense that life has a meaning greater than what we can see. In these experiences, we glimpse something beyond the finite, something eternal, even if we cannot fully comprehend it. Faith, then, is not just a blind leap into nothingness. It is a response to these glimpses of the infinite. It's an act of trust that despite our limitations, this ultimate reality is there, and that it holds meaning and purpose for us. The leap of faith is necessary because, as finite beings, we cannot prove God or reduce God to something we can control. But through that leap, we open ourselves to the possibility of a relationship with the infinite, with God. In essence, God may indeed be that mysterious source at the core of all existence, but the leap of faith allows us to live in a way that acknowledges and aligns with that mystery. Whether we experience it in small, fleeting moments or in profound spiritual encounters.
How did your teachings stand out from what was already taught in your lifetime?
My teachings stood in stark contrast to the rationalism of my time. The prevailing thought, especially in Hegel's system, was that reason could explain everything, that history unfolded according to a logical process. But I saw the limitations of this approach. Reason cannot explain faith. It cannot explain the most profound aspects of human existence, anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith. I also rejected the complacency of the Church, which had become comfortable with its place in society. I insisted that Christianity is not about being part of a respectable social institution. It is about the individual's personal relationship with God, marked by suffering, sacrifice, and inward struggle. My focus on subjectivity, on the individual's lived experience, was revolutionary. I was not interested in abstract systems or objective truths. I was interested in what it means to exist, here and now, and how one confronts the ultimate questions of life.
How can your teachings be relevant for sensitive individuals who worry about the uncertainties of life?
To those who are sensitive to the uncertainties of life, I would say this: anxiety and uncertainty are not things to be avoided. They are part of the human condition, and in them we find our freedom. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the awareness that we are responsible for our choices. It is terrifying, yes, but it also opens the possibility of true selfhood. Do not flee from uncertainty. Embrace it. In that uncertainty, you confront your own limits and your dependence on something greater than yourself. Faith is precisely the act of trusting in God in the face of uncertainty, of taking the leap into the unknown without guarantees. This leap is not easy, but it is where true meaning is found. Life is full of uncertainties, and it is in these moments that you are most alive, most capable of becoming who you truly are. I know it's hard, but embrace your despair. Despair can be the beginning of your deepest journey toward understanding and faith.
Søren Kierkegaard, thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Søren Kierkegaard, please share it with your friends, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast. In our next episode on the Undead Sages podcast, we'll talk to Sigmund Freud, an Austrian psychiatrist who founded the psychoanalytical approach to therapy, and whose impact on psychology can hardly be overstated. Thank you for listening, and I hope to catch you on the next podcast.